Probably a good time to make a quick announcement that we are recording this. So at the end of my one-on-one Q&A with Sam, when we open it up to questions, for those who want to ask Sam a question directly, you can raise your hand, and Caroline will one by one let people make them visible to ask Sam a question. But if you want to remain anonymous and not be part of the recording, you can still participate. Feel free to submit a question in the chat, and I can ask those questions on your behalf, so everyone can have a chance to ask Sam questions directly. Great. All right.
Great. Saul, thanks for having me. I appreciate you and everyone joining for the conversation.
Thank you, Sam, and welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Saul Gorman. I'm a Harvard College class of '09. And a brief announcement that this event tonight is sponsored by the Harvard chapter of FAIR, the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, and by the Harvard Alumni for Free Speech. If you'd like to learn more about those groups, please feel free to visit their websites. But tonight, I'd like to focus our time on speaking with Sam. I'll begin with some prepared questions, and then we'll open up the discussion. Sam is a Harvard College graduate, successful entrepreneur and investor. He's also, as I'm sure you're all aware, seeking nomination to the ballot for the Harvard Board of Overseers. So Sam, let's start by letting me ask you about your background and what led you to start this campaign, given your journey to this point.
Yeah, so look, I think Harvard's an amazing institution. I was so proud to go there. I got so much out of it. You know, it's been an important part of my life. Like, I built a lot of the most important relationships in my life there. Both, my wife, when I met there, a lot of the people I've worked and built companies with over the years, were classmates. And I think it's an amazing institution. And so when you see what happened this fall, and the huge failures from an administrative standpoint, the anti-Semitism on campus. And I think, really importantly, you saw a lot, when you see kind of a lot of these things you kind of heard whispered about in terms of academic freedom and free speech really come to a head dramatically. The first thing I did, like a lot of my friends, is said, we called the development office and said, look, any outstanding gifts, they're no longer unrestricted. We're going to put them in the most esoteric academic thing we can figure out, because we don't want to be giving money to this institution in this state. A lot of my friends said, we're just, they're kind of like, it's time to step away, right? This is not the institution we went to. I kind of thought about that, and I was disappointed and sad about that, both on a personal level, from a personal connection perspective, but also because I think Harvard literally is the most notable education brand in America and perhaps the world, right? And to just give up on it, right, and then walk away seems like a huge failure for the future. And so I said to myself, well, what can I do beyond opting out, right? And just saying we're done, right? Or saying, hey, I'm just not going to donate until things are fixed for whatever that's worth, right? To the school with a $50 billion endowment that's intentionally supposed to be able to kind of resist outside forces. And I looked at the Overseers Board, which is, as many of you probably know, there are two important boards at Harvard. There's the corporation and there's the overseers. And the story is generally told that the corporation is incredibly powerful and the overseers are not. And it's just about academic review. And the corporations where all the decisions are made. And, the overseers in some ways is just kind of almost like a honorary board that does academic review in a lightweight way. But that's actually not true, right? The overseers actually have quite a bit of power. They just haven't exercised it recently. And so the more I dug into that, and the more I understood kind of the points of leverage and the fact that as an alum, you actually can run a process. While it's difficult to get nominated for it outside of HAA and the traditional channels, I was like, if I really care about Harvard, which I do, and think it's important, which I do, it's almost incumbent on me to step up and try to affect change right at the leadership level through the Overseers Board. So that's how this started in mid-December, is I said, look, I'm disappointed like many, but I don't want to lean out. So how can I do the opposite of that?
That's great, Sam. So you mentioned about the Board of Overseers. There are a lot of different conceptions about what the board can or cannot accomplish, and what individual members can and cannot do. Tell us a little bit about your vision for, if you are elected, how you would use that power and position of influence to try to affect change.
Yeah, so I think the things to understand, again, is if you think about the formal powers, this is the most way to describe it, is Harvard's is chartered under a 1650 charter. This is like an Enlightenment era document, right? You're thinking about like basically the same time, a little bit even before, obviously, you had the US government put together, right? But it had these kind of two boards with separate powers that were supposed to provide checks and balances. You had the corporation, which again, the analogy, it's not perfect, but humor me. It's almost like the Senate of Harvard, right? And then there's the overseers, which is kind of like the House, right? And again, it's a loose, I'm taking some liberties here, but you get the point. And so if you think about the overseers technically have power over, they can approve or deny new presidents, right? That means they get to ask questions of those presidents, and they're actually supposed to not just rubber stamp it, but really actually be validating this is who you want to lead the university. Same thing with the corporation members. The corporation does basically chooses successors to appoint, but the overseers have to approve it, right? And so the process of saying we have to approve these things as overseers, that this is a key function, candidly, my sense is in the last many decades, it's really languished, right? It's kind of been a rubber stamp exercise. So yes, technically there are overseers on the presidential search committee, and technically they're approving it, but they weren't really exerting very much power or force. And so you think about it, if I can get elected onto the overseers, I will only be one of 30 people, right? I will not be a majority, right? I can't, but what I can do is I'll be in the room to ask questions, right? And so when the questions about someone's academic integrity should have been asked and should have been asked pointedly, I can make sure they are, right? I can start making sure that those types of conversations happen. I also think, and this is the really important thing that Saul, you and I touched on briefly in an earlier conversation, I think is worth calling out is, the more I've dug into this, the more I've come to the conclusion that as much as many of us can be very concerned about academic free speech on campus and kind of the culture, there is a massive silent majority of people in leadership positions in the administration, at the corporation, senior professors, you name it, who are actually very aligned, right, with a lot of the principles that I think we've been lacking, right, in the last several years. But they're terrified to speak out, right? They're terrified to stand up. They'll call me and say, "We're glad you're running. Please don't ever use my name, but here's what I think is really going on, or here's some perspective." And that's been a really interesting set of conversations. But what it's made me think is beyond the power to kind of ask the questions, do review, be in the room, and take the overseers and hopefully make them a more serious governing body, which I think they need to be to check and balance the corporation and the direction of the university. I also think you can kind of provide some air cover or start to that hopefully help some of those other voices come out that are there, right? They've just been so, they're just so scared, candidly. It's such a culture of not free speech that they're not speaking up. And that's how we're getting to the place we're getting to.
Right. I wanted to dig in on the subject of free speech, which is one of these key issues that there may be that silent majority that feels a certain way about it. I know we have a lot of folks on this call that are very passionate about this issue. But there are some nuances here, right? And it can be hard to articulate in a Twitter post or a tabloid news headline. We're seeing over the years maybe the degradation of free speech on campus, and we all have heard about the fire ratings rating Harvard last in the nation for free speech on campus. Yeah, it's embarrassing, of course. But we also are now following October 7th and some of the disruptions on campus. There have been calls to perhaps restrict speech or perhaps enforce rules more evenly. With the nuances here in this issue, where do you fall? How do you approach the current moment and articulate your own vision for what free speech should look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a good thing to call out because it is more nuanced than you usually can get across in a few characters. But here's how I see things, which is, first of all, Harvard is an academic institution with an academic mission, right? And so that is the true north, is academic excellence, right, across the board. That is what it exists for and what it stands for and what everyone should be aligned against. And I think a silent majority is, they're just not speaking up enough, right? Free speech, free inquiry from an academic perspective is critical to that academic mission, right? If you think about Enlightenment era, like the things we have figured out about the world that make the world work, right, make the world a better place, free inquiry, which is one of the key things of serving that academic mission. And so in the context of the classroom, in the context of, civil debate, in the context of education and learning, free speech should not be even a question, right, inside the classroom in those settings, right? And so to me, that's when I think about free speech and why it matters. It's that academic, mission-oriented, on-campus inquiry style of speech, right? And you need a diverse set of opinions and faculty, from different backgrounds who are able and willing to express those views to find the truth. Then there's the stuff about on-campus protests, right? Disrupting that academic process, et cetera. And here's the way I think about it. You know, in the end of the day, remember, the true north is academics and academic excellence, right? So does that mean, can you disrupt students that are studying in Widener? No, right? Can you have bullhorns in the middle of the night on private property in Harvard Yard so that kids can't study and you can't sleep, right? No, right? So to me, the free speech that matters is the free speech in the classroom. Beyond that, Harvard is a private institution, right? It's private property. And that doesn't mean that students shouldn't be able to express their views. If they want to express their views, they can go to Boston Common. Like, they can do whatever they want, right, as citizens of America. But I think that's the key thing to understand the differentiation is we shouldn't let this idea and ideal of academic free speech, or the point of free speech, which I absolutely believe in, right, create permission to do things which is not really even about speaking. It's about shouting and creating disruption, right, which harms free speech, doesn't help it, right, in the end of the day, right? Now, again, students are free citizens, and if they want to go to Boston Common and do their marches, that's fine. But the second you say, you know, you're not really trying to speak freely in an academic for the purpose of pursuing truth, right, which is clearly limited on campus. Instead, you're trying to disrupt students who are here to study, right, or make it feel unsafe for them, or things like that. That, in my mind, in my vision, is not something the university should be supporting.
Thanks for laying that out for us. Like I said, difficult issue. I'm sure there will be more questions on that when we get to the Q&A.
Sure.
I want to turn to the recent departure of Claudine Gay and the presidency at Harvard. Tell us about first part of the question. Tell us about your view on Claudine Gay, how that whole situation was handled with her being asked to resign. And then second part, tell us about your vision for what should be the board and the corporation be looking for in the next president, and what should that person ideally do to make changes on campus?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the question with Claudine Gay, you know, sitting from January 24th, right, 2024, right, was always a question of, could she effectively lead the university forward, right? She clearly made mistakes. I don't think anyone on campus would say that she didn't make administrative mistakes, right, throughout the fall in terms of her handling of 10-7 and the Senate hearings and everything else that went on, right, and the congressional hearings, et cetera. So that's all clear, but at every moment, the question was not, did this person make mistakes? The question is she able to lead the university forward? And I think what happened was it became increasingly clear that she was not able to lead the university forward. Both as an administrator, she wasn't strong enough. She really flubbed a really important, you know, period, especially in the context of her earlier speech and rhetoric, right, around other things like George Floyd. It was just very stark and a real problem. She did not lead the campus well, leaving Jewish students to feel unsafe and things like that. That's table stakes for an administrator. And then academically, you know, as more and more of this stuff came out about plagiarism, regardless of what you think, right, about the details, right, because the details are complicated and confusing. The question is this the type of scholar, right, that professors are going to look up to, that students can look up to as an example of the best, right? And I think it became increasingly clear with the sloppiness, whatever you want to call it, right, that she was not, right? That's not the kind of the standards you'd expect, right? And therefore make it very difficult to recruit the best talents in the world, be it students or professors, to Harvard and keep the Harvard brand as the best academic institution in the world when you're not led by the best, right? And so that's kind of how I looked at it. I think the whole thing was extremely unfortunate, and candidly, I think the corporation handled it awfully, right? Which is part of the reason I think they really need help is, you know, from an administrative or leadership perspective, the flip-flopping of full support to not full support, not sticking to their guns either direction, you know, the kind of the back and forth of the whole thing, I think was really very poorly handled. And then the communication around it was terrible. So again, I think all in all, a disastrous period for Harvard. In terms of going forward, which is what matters more, and again, it is the thing the overseers have more of a stake in, right? Because they are approving the next president, right, of Harvard. Look, I kind of think it's in some ways the inverse of what we just saw, right? True academic excellence, right? Someone who everyone can look at and say, if I'm a professor, you know, and I need someone to look up to academically, if I'm a student wondering what university cares the most and is going to represent academics first, you need someone who's academically excellent, right? Not good, but excellent, best in the world. And then I think administratively, you need someone strong, right? You need someone who, and again, this is a tough thing. It's like you're managing an enormous platform, right? You know, and it's difficult. Like, you know, being an executive at a huge company is hard. Running a university, especially one as pressurized as Harvard, is very difficult. But you need someone who's going to be able to stand strong, have principles, communicate them clearly, keep students safe, move the university in the right direction and not kind of kowtow in different directions. And again, it's a tall order, but I'd say that again, I do believe that being president of Harvard, even today, is still probably one of the most prestigious jobs in academia. And I would hope and expect the university can find someone truly excellent.
We can hope.
We can hope. And we can hold them accountable to that. I mean, it's in, the good news is, in some ways, these crises create moments for change. And, it's one of those things where you better believe, of course I will if I'm on the board of overseers, but overseers as co-signers on the next president, they better ask hard academic questions, right, about the fitness of their next candidate, right? If they don't, right, the credibility will be completely shot, right? And so hopefully this kind of creates a real break in a moment for that.
Great. One last question, and then I want to open it up to those who are attending who might want to ask questions. We talked about free speech. I want to talk about DEI. It's a topic that is divisive, polarizing, and with the last few months, I think we've seen a lot more attention put on it, even more so than following the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action earlier last year. Yep. There's some that are saying that the root cause of some of this anti-free speech environment on campus and anti-Semitic environment might be deriving from DEI, and we should dismantle it. And I think there are others that are taking the position that perhaps it needs to be reformed, or perhaps that's not the cause of any of these problems. What are your views on the broadly speaking DEI movement and the diversity apparatus on campus and how it relates to what we're talking about today?
Obviously a touchy subject, which is part of the reason we're in this mess, right? In the first place, I would say. Here's how I look at it again. The mission of Harvard is academic, right? I think, I'm not sure everyone in the world agrees on that, by the way, but I think the vast majority of people do, despite some of the statements that have been put out about different types of missions and things like that. And so if you say that the true north is academics, there is, in my mind, no question that diversity of thought, diversity of background, diversity of a lot of things, which can lead to more ideas and broader perspectives, is actually a key part of that academic mission, right? So DEI is not the thing that is served. It can be in service of the academic mission if done well, right? I also think, for what it's worth, when you think about the Supreme Court decision and diversity and backgrounds, look, the reality is, if you're trying to find the absolute best academic potential in the world, there's every argument in the world that a kid from an underprivileged financial background or lots of different who has faced adversity, who scores a little bit less well in the SATs, might be a far better candidate than someone who scored a perfect score but had every help in every aid in the world, right? So I think that there is some component to that where you have to have a more broad view of what diversity of lots of different things will drive in terms of actually the true north of the university, which has to be academic excellence, right? Now, that's the D part. The E and the I part, that's a little tougher. And this is a place where I'll be honest, maybe I'm wading a little bit into murkier ground or more political ground. I'm less excited about those things, right? I'm a believer in kind of the best outcomes, right? And excellence, and I do think that the equity and inclusion, and by the way, I think some of those terms are now deprecated. They're now changing some of the letters based on the Supreme Court decision and trying to kind of wiggle through it. I'll be honest, I'm not a very big fan of those things, right? So I'm a huge believer in the D, right? I do think there can be real efforts around that are accretive to the academic mission. To me, the E and the I, again, I think it's very important people feel comfortable on campus, and part of that is they're comfortable to express who they are and their viewpoints and things like that. But I am much more, I'd say, in favor of meritocracy ultimately as a goal. It's very hard to achieve, but as the goal versus equity.
Great. Well, thank you, Sam. Thank you for humoring my questions. Let's open it up to the larger group.
Absolutely. That's what we're here to talk about.
All right. I see actually there's a question here in the Q&A that's been sitting there for a few minutes. So let's start with that. The question is, how do you feel about students who want to protest peacefully in Harvard Yard? Does your view change if they say things that are hurtful to others, but not rising to a call to violence or harassment?
Look, again, I'll kind of restate my first principles on this, right? Which is that the academic mission is the key, right? And the best academic environment is the key. And then I do very much believe that free speech is part of that, right? It's actually a critical component to that kind of ultimate goal. So look, do I have a problem personally? No, I think it's fine. Like, it doesn't seem like, even though Harvard is private property, right, with that academic mission, it doesn't seem like a peaceful protest that isn't threatening students, isn't getting in the way of anything, isn't hurting their ability to study or focus, is a big problem. Now, the second it rises to the point where it's hurting that academic mission and the goal of a private institution, again, I think students should be perfectly free to speak, probably not on private property, right? And I think that's kind of the key distinction I would make there. But no, I mean, again, I think the default assumption of free speech everywhere, with kind of the caveat of the academic goals being the primary one, is how I would look at those types of issues. I will say, actually, before we move on, or if other people have questions, is like, as part of that, I would say that whatever is done does have to be done equally, right? It can't be up to administrators' whims to make decisions about what counts in what ways. And so I do think, when you think about when you get to those very tough lines of what is peaceful and not disruptive versus what becomes disruptive and things like that, it's hard to define. I'm the first to admit it, right? In fact, the irony is I have a lot of experience with this, right? I worked at Facebook for a long time. In the period, it went from being a small application to a global platform, and it was part of a lot of the key conversations with how to deal with that, right? How to deal with different forms of speech. Now, I'll be the first to say the actual things that came out of that process, I don't agree with all of them at all, right? I think there were definitely mistakes made, but I've seen that process and how hard it is to define that line and how important it is to then apply it equally once defined.
All right. Do we have any hands raised? Anyone that wants to ask a question directly? If not, I can keep going.
No, I think David has a question.
Oh, here we go. David.
Yeah, how are things going in terms of the number of nominees you've gotten and the number you need?
Great question, David. So there's a long history I won't bore you with unless you're curious about how these numbers have been set and evolved over time. The short version is that this process is set up to be nearly impossible by HAA, so that they can basically keep their own nominated candidates versus let out outsiders in, while technically still making it possible. So it's going well, is what I'd say, but I still need a lot of help. So the last check-in I got was a while ago. So I'm not actually fully up to date on the number of ballots, but I was still a little bit below 1,000, but doing well in terms of collecting the 3,300 I need, with kind of January 31st being the line. And I think a lot of people, traditional Harvard students, like doing it in the last minute. So I am optimistic. There's been great engagement. People have been joining my mailing list and kind of helping, but I think this is the key period in the next 2 weeks where I probably need to triple the number of votes I have right now to get across the line. As far as I know, I am the person, when I started doing this, I was the only one I know of that was doing this. There's now 7 people who are looking at kind of doing some version of this process and trying to get nominated. As far as I know, I have the most votes of anyone so far, right? And no one has crossed that line yet. But again, I'm not 100% sure that's true. That's kind of based a little bit on anecdotal evidence I have on that. And that's kind of what we need to do. But so infinitely doable, but certainly going to take a push.
All right, we've got some more questions in the Q&A, so let me go to the first one here. Did you learn anything by reviewing the original charter regarding powers the overseers have that they may not be using and or are responsible for, but are functioning instead as rubber stamps?
Yeah, I mean, look, the 1650 charter is on the internet, right? And actually, what's interesting is the overseers predate the corporation. It's actually a slightly a thing that got included, and it is worth reading if you're curious about these types of things. The overseers really, again, the negative power is the key thing, right? That they have more than anything else, right? Over who ends up on the corporation, who is president, some other key appointments that I don't think they've been using or asking the right questions around from anything I've seen. And so I think that is the key thing. Now, when you get into the details of Harvard administration, which, by the way, I've gotten quite an education in from many administrators in the last few weeks, there's all sorts of crazy stuff, right, in there, right? The corporation, for instance, was expanded recently, right, and the terms of it were changed. It is not at all clear that was illegal, right? But the problem is there's really no one to sue them, right? And so the reality is, like, there's all sorts of questions about what's there or not. This is all done technically under the Massachusetts state legislature, right? So the question of how you change these things, or should you empower the overseers more, things like that, all actually technically roll up to Massachusetts, right? Which is a whole other set of worms. So there's a lot of interesting kind of almost ancient law that you can kind of piece through on this. But I think the way from a practical perspective to think about it is, if you ask any person in modern times, the overseers really, they say, oh, the overseers aren't powerful, right? They really just do academic review, whereas that's really not true. Like, they have the right and ability to ask questions across the org and basically agree to any major appointment at the university, is the way to think about it.
Great. Thanks, Sam. Next question. It might be a bit of a tricky one. A lot of us have heard that Bill Ackman, but who's been making a lot of noise about things going on at Harvard, has endorsed a slate of candidates for a petition to the board. You weren't among those four. Curious about if you've been in touch with him, if that was by design, and what reasons there might be for that.
It's a really good question, and I don't have a full answer, but let me tell you a little bit of what I do know, right?
Okay.
So I obviously, because Bill Ackman, I think has been right about a lot of stuff. Not everything, but I think he's been right about a lot of stuff. Have certainly been forwarding some of his notes with comment to administrators, whatever, since mid-December. And when I decided that I was going to run, I got his email. I don't know him personally. I have a lot of friends in common with him, and immediately messaged him and said, hey, would you ever consider endorsing me? I'd love to talk to you about Harvard. Crickets. I then had a bunch of people that are mutual close connections that I know he listens to, right? These are not like people from his periphery, forward notes, because we have a lot of friends in common. They said, oh, of course he's going to respond to me, and he didn't respond to me. He did like my tweet for some reason about running for overseer, but then he kind of announced this alternate slate. It's an interesting question. I've talked to some people, actually even as early as today, who asked the same question and said, no, I'm really close with him. He must just not have got your message. I think he got the message, personally, but we'll see. I mean, obviously he has such a larger megaphone. It's useful. Now, I will say on the flip side, it is a double-edged sword, right? I think his endorsement in any way, shape, or form in a few ways. First, the candidates he endorsed are very conservative, right? I'm not even quite sure that he understands how conservative they are. For instance, one of them is very close.
Conservative politically, in the traditional left-right.
Well, I mean, again, we're going to get into dangerous ground in a public forum, but I said they're Trump people, right? They're really, to the point that, one of them is very, very closely connected to Breitbart and things like that. I'm not even sure he realizes that, right? But in terms of being included in that group, I'm a business guy, right? I'm a centrist business person who wants to see action on these issues. I'm not that far out on the spectrum. And so again, the megaphone is useful. Being included, that set, is a little more complicated, is my view. The other thing I keep in mind with the Ackman set is I don't think that they necessarily studied the rules very well for this election, because he has this slate of 4 people, but the way the whole process is designed, and it is unfair, but it is true, you can't get more than 2 people on the ballot anyway, right? And so, again, I don't know Bill personally, and again, it could be that I'm that tomorrow he's like, oh, I forgot Sam, and then I'll be like, great, I appreciate the megaphone, because obviously this is a reach game to some degree, but I'd say that, again, I am disappointed he hasn't engaged with me, but I'm not totally devastated. I think that the reality is that this will get done if enough grassroots people, want someone like me to do this role. It's not going to be because someone's yelling on Twitter.
Yeah, you raise an interesting point about in the general election that having his support might be so polarizing it could be to those candidates' detriment. But
yeah, and I do think when people start doing a little bit deeper research, that's just going to be a challenge, right? I think for some of these candidates, given the Harvard community, right, to get across the line.
Right. All right. Another question in the chat. Professor Mansfield in the Wall Street Journal recently pointed to the remarkable and growing lack of political representation of Republicans and / conservatives among both faculty and students. Do you think this is a real phenomenon? Do you think it is a problem? And what could be done about it?
Do I think it's a real phenomenon? Yes. I mean, I think even in my era, which was 2005, was 20 years ago, that was already, I think, the case, right? In terms of the Harvard thing. Do I think it's a problem? Absolutely, right? And I'll look at it from 2 directions as a problem. One, Harvard's goal is to have the best of the best. If you think the best of the best does not include Republicans, right, you're crazy, right? There are from students and professors to cut that off, right, and to create an environment that doesn't promote that. You're hurting your academic mission, and so I think that is a real issue. Now, what could be done? Look, one of the most disappointing conversations I had this fall was with a father who has children, Harvard grad, who has children who are seniors. And we were talking about kind of what was going on in the political climate and things like that. And I made some comment about how, but Harvard's a great school. And I said, Sam, you don't get it. It's like, my daughters didn't even apply. Like they're great students. They're getting to great Ivy League schools, but like, they don't want to deal with Harvard, right? Harvard. And like, I think that kind of goes to this whole thing. Like, they're not even necessarily conservative, but like, I think what you found is like Harvard is self-selecting its way into a narrower band of people and beliefs, which is a real disservice to the overall academic mission, right? So, again, I consider myself a centrist. I'm pretty free market oriented, right? In every way, shape, and form, ideas through capital. I'm relatively liberal, although it obviously depends on the setting you're in from a social perspective, right? I do live in California after all, but I think that's kind of the answer is yes, it is a problem. Yes, it is real. And I think the only way to fix that is going to be to like promote the academics, which is why people come and why it stays a great university, and the free speech culture, which makes people feel okay expressing their beliefs and being who they are on campus ideologically.
It's a good segue into the next question, which is also about free speech and how to practically deal with some of the issues you just raised. So if elected, would you push for a free speech orientation curriculum for incoming students? And would that apply to the college and the grad schools?
Look, again, I think the honest answer is I'd want to know more before I specifically answered whether I think there should be nothing or something like that, right? If that makes sense. I'm pretty certain that what's happening right now from the news reports I've seen, right, which is quite the opposite, right? Athletes being told, that they might face disciplinary action for fat phobia or things that just seem wild to me, right? That's completely not what you want, right? In terms of like the training being given, but whether, I would ideally love a culture where the students coming in really understood what free speech meant and understood how to have civil discourse and understood that already. And so you didn't need any trainings. But if you ended up in a place where administratively everyone said, no, we need actual training about that, okay. I mean, I think if framed properly, it could be okay. But I think it's a hard question to answer exactly without a lot more study about whether there should be nothing or an explicit course about it.
Great. Okay. Questions coming fast in the Q&A. Are you finding much support among your alumni peers? Or do you find that some or most have succumbed to the pressure of DEI coming from their children's schools and or their employers?
I think that we live in a world of a huge silent majority, right, that is very into effectively the academic mission, is very skeptical of things like DEI, et cetera. Now, again, there's a spectrum to this. I am sure there's a lot of peers or people at Harvard that I don't speak to because we're in different circles who might very much disagree with me on this. But I'd say like when I look around at, I've at this point emailed, connected with thousands of Harvard alums, literally, like that's not an exaggeration, and there's a huge amount of support, right? So I do think there's a huge silent majority. I think if we're being candid in a free speech context, that look, the reality is that the George Floyd era made a lot of people who believe in some of these principles very nervous to speak up, right? It was already not going in the right direction for a whole bunch of reasons. And that was a really pointed moment that was really sad, right? That basically everyone said, this is not the time to speak, right? And in some ways, again, in some long historical arc, right? If you look at George Floyd as a moment where that kind of happened, and then 10/7 in the response as kind of in some ways the yin and the yang to this era, like this destabilized era, where all of a sudden people who care about these issues are much more willing to say, no, like we need to speak up. Like this is no longer okay, right? We can't drift administratively in a direction like this. There's a story there that I think we might look back on in many years and see, and I hope to look back on from a healthy Harvard and say, look, that was a really tough period, but at least it opened the opportunity for change.
And to follow up to that question, with having spoken to so many people now, 1,000, so you said quite a few. Are you? I've
at least reached out to thousands.
Okay.
I've spoken to hundreds. How about that?
Hundreds. That's still a good sample size. Are you seeing any generational differences? And I raise that point because I know a lot of us have heard about polling or just anecdotal evidence that suggests that the youngest generations are less supportive of free speech. generally speaking.
Yeah,
in
it's
this
scary,
country.
isn't it? I mean,
Right.
I've seen those polls too extensively, and they're terrifying, to be totally honest. Again, it's hard to say because the people I talk to, I think, are going to be broadly aligned with the viewpoints I'm expressing, right? And so, if you said to me from the conversations I had, am I fairly confident that people from much older generations agree with this, right? And they might not know how to actually log in and use their Harvard key, which, by the way, is a disaster to vote, but like they agree with this, and that younger people might be more split. I would believe that from all the polling I've seen. But from the interactions I've had, the people who've been interacting back with me are the people who are like, yeah, this is obviously right, which, and this is the direction we need to go. And thank you for at least standing up and trying is kind of the narrative that I've been getting. So, but we're all very biased by our samples, right? Is the reality. One of the beautiful parts of a place like Harvard is supposed to be that you have the biased sample of academic high achievers, but a broad spectrum where you actually can get a taste of a lot of the different conversations that are happening versus the filter bubbles we find ourselves in most of our lives.
Right. Next question from the Q&A. Can you talk more about your views of free speech outside of the academic context? What if a student distributes an email or writes a piece in a student journal that declares her support for Intifada? Should Harvard do anything about that?
Look, it's a really obviously hard question, and I appreciate getting in this setting where I know people are taking it seriously as a question, as opposed to playing a gotcha game of some sort. I mean, here's the way I think about it. Again, Harvard is a private, academically focused institution, right? And I think that the academic side of freedom of speech, as we discussed, is unquestionable and clear in the classrooms. Outside of that, I think that the whole lens has to be, is this neutral, help or hurt the academic mission, right? If it helps the academic mission, great, right? That's the type of free speech that actually you want to promote. If it's neutral to the academic mission, the default should be free speech. So like, that's completely fine, right? I think people should be able to express their views, very broadly. When it tips into being harmful to the private institution's academic mission, actively, right? That's when I do think you have to talk about limitations, not in the context of should people be free to speak, they should be able to speak in lots of forms. You post any meme you want on Facebook. You can go to Boston Common and shout your head off, like whatever, right? But purely from like, is it actively harming the university's academic mission using university property? That's where it's a little bit challenging, right? I think, and I'm not going to give, I think maybe the answer that some in this audience would want, which is a pure free speech to no end type argument. Like, I do think that there are some places where it's disrupting the academic mission and you do need to limit it. But I think it's a nuanced, challenging problem. And my bet is that even among the true hardcore free speech advocates, that maybe, in these things, I would say that I am very close to you in terms of the practical application of almost all of these things. But I do think there's a line, again, when you're actively disrupting the students' ability to study or the institution's academic mission, where as a private institution, you should say enough.
Mm-hmm. One more question here. In addition to supporting your candidacy, are there other ways you'd recommend we as alumni can become more involved in directing Harvard's future?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Obviously, I'd love your support individually with nominations and then sharing. This is a hand-to-hand game in terms of getting these things done. And I can promise, and I'm very serious about driving this and being this thing. I think I spent a lot of time to try to help Harvard forward. So that I obviously appreciate. Beyond that, here's the most interesting thing I've found, I think, is talking to a lot of individual alums and alum groups. HAA, the Harvard official alumni association, I don't think it really is very well representing most alumni, right? It's representing a very small number of alumni who are engaged in Harvard clubs in New York and Boston in a very specific way, right? And that's telling that only about 10% of Harvard alums even vote in these elections, right? So what's interesting is that there's all these other groups, the Harvard Jewish Alum Association, the free speech advocates, there's all these things, and they're great, but they're all relatively small, right? And I actually think that the way it's an interesting challenge, right? But I think the way that alums can have more of a voice together is we're going to have to figure out a way for all these kind of groups, which are great and should have their nucleus and core separate. Like, you should have your people who are advocating for different things, but a way for them to come together collaboratively to create a larger force together, right? And I mean, a silly way to frame this isn't what I really mean, but just for the sake of argumentation and spitballing, we almost need like a shadow HAA, right? That has more heft to it and more weight, and like actually has not just the donors in one pocket who are talking about one thing, but like people really pulled together. And I will tell you an interesting story, which is, I think Penn has been far more effective at this than Harvard, right? And the reason is, if you think about Penn, it's a much narrower group of alums, right? They all kind of, I'm going to generalize, but they all work in New York finance. They all know each other, right? They're able to coordinate far better. Whereas Harvard is such a diverse school of people with diverse interests that everyone's in their little pocket, and it's super hard to get a critical mass of alums together to do anything other than through HAA, which again, I don't think is really well representing alums' interests. And so when you think about ways to help, again, I'd love your candidacy. I'd love to be part of the solution here at the university, but I'd also love to help kind of be part of the solution at the alum level, right? And seeing if we can't build more of a community and larger movement. There are 330,000 Harvard alums, right? And if you can pull that group together, in a more meaningful way, where everyone's kind of has some connection to the university and can think about how to vote in elections or how to advocate with the president or things like that, I think it'd be a very powerful force. So that's the other thing I've been thinking a lot about in terms of how alums can have more of a say. Sending your 1 cent donation, it might feel good and you should do it if you want to, but it doesn't meaningfully have enough weight, right? So how do we kind of build that type of organization?
Right. All right, next question here is about admissions. The percentage of Jewish students has steadily fallen to 5%, and there is talk that it might be reduced to as low as 2%. What do you do to address this issue?
I think you just refocus on academic excellence. And again, I'm Jewish, and when I went, obviously there's a much higher percentage of Jewish students. If you step back for a second and say, what should the percentage of Jewish students at Harvard be, right? I don't actually know the answer to that, right? Like, the reality is obviously a very small percentage of the US population and the global population. It's historically been a very large percentage of Harvard. And, we can get into arguments about academic achievement and things like that. But I actually think that we'd be much better off saying, let's step back for a second. Let's think about who the best candidates are, full stop, right? And if we step back from that, we would find out kind of naturally what that population looks like, right? But instead of trying to manage it to a specific number, right? And again, this kind of goes hand in hand with some of the Supreme Court case that just came out. I think, there's two ways to look at what comes from the Supreme Court. One is going to be, well, people come up with clever ways to go around the Supreme Court, right? Which is, I think, a lot of what the discussion is now. It's like, well, we still kind of like our admissions policies and the way we do them. We're just going to come up with clever ways to kind of circumvent the now clear law about this. The other is you say, no, like the spirit of what the Supreme Court decided is right. Like, let's just admit the best candidates. And if there are more Jewish candidates as a result, great. And if there are fewer, okay, right, is almost the way I would look at it.
Great. Thank you, Sam. Our next question is a bit of a longer one. Let me read through this. Do you think that as a global institution, Harvard is struggling with its responsibility to liberal democracy and our democratic republic, with 20% of incoming undergrads international, and some who may not understand or share the values of our democratic republic, including free speech and civil rights? What responsibility does Harvard have to be institutionally biased toward liberal values instead of neutral?
Yeah, I think liberal values are really great, right? Is what I would start with and say, like, I think one of the things that is very sad to me, right, is this narrative that clearly, at least the story is, and I think has developed, in the youth to some degree, that somehow the West is bad, right, or like, or this kind of the oppressor oppressed narrative, which just candidly, I'll be honest, is ridiculous, right, from my perspective. So I do think that Harvard, really does benefits from having that type of culture, and is clearly one of the key institutions in terms of brand of that culture. Now, in terms of, what percentage international versus national and things like that, again, I really think the only answer I can reliably give is academics first, right? And, I do think that the reality is if again, remember, you need a free speech culture to have good inquiry, right? So if you have a bunch of students who might be brilliant, but they're not open to free speech, they're not open to the culture of free speech, they're not open to what makes Harvard a great academic institution, because I think that is part of it, they're probably not a good fit, right, is what I would say. So I think that's kind of the thing you have to balance is, again, what the ultimate goal is on a 100-year basis to have the strongest academic institution in the world with the best brand in the world and the best academics in the world going on. And then you think about all of these things as inputs to that, right? And you think about what the trades are that you make. But again, I have a very hard time believing that, again, you think of the scientific revolution and what liberalism in the West has brought to the world, with all the challenges. But like when you think about those types of things, it's very hard for me to imagine a world where you had a bunch of students that were actually the best candidates for that academic mission who didn't believe in free speech or liberal values, because I actually think free speech and liberal values are a key component of what makes it all work.
So it's a really interesting discussion. When I think we've heard from Harvard a lot of talk of globalization and being a global institution, and perhaps this issue runs a bit deeper and is connected to some of these other issues we've been talking about.
100%. I think one thing I will say that I think has come up much is, there's this interesting challenge, right? I'll tell you an interesting thing about, which is we talk about Harvard as the premier academic institution and that being the goal and things like that. Here's the reality. Harvard actually sends fewer undergrads to graduate programs than almost any other top tier school in the country, right? Which is kind of curious, right? And the reason is—
I didn't know that. That's actually very surprising.
Isn't it? And like the reason is, if you think about who they select for in general and who's showing up, it's people who want to make a difference and have impact, right? And a lot of those people aren't going to graduate school, right? They're not going to PhD programs. They're going off to, act in the world. And so, I think this is an interesting thing, which is because that's true, and because Harvard is seen as such a symbol, it's this very rich prize, right, for everyone, right? It's this rich prize intellectually, and there's this thing where people say, well, what is going to have them? If we can change Harvard, we can change the world plus 20 years, right? Is almost the way to think about it. And I think that creates a lot of stress on the university, right? And it's a very challenging thing to manage, right? So, but I think you have to step back for it and just remember what the mission is, which is academic, right? And if you just stick to that as the core principle and say Harvard's job is not to solve all the world's problems. There are many world problems, right? We can't solve them all from a university. It's a university, right? And you start from that and the principles of being a university, it will lead you to good places, right? The second you start saying, well, Harvard's mission is actually to save the world, right? Or like all of these issues or problems, we're going to solve them through Harvard. That is actually the politically minded thinking that I think gets you into a lot of trouble and ends up making, in some ways, Harvard this like hot potato people are shifting around in different directions, which I think is extremely damaging to the university and its long-term place as a key educational institution.
All right, thanks, Sam. We've got one more question in here, and I think it's actually from one of our Harvard Alumni for Free Speech members wanting to plug their group as possibly part of this shadow alumni group that you've mentioned. I think it's only fair to mention our other co-sponsor, the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. I certainly think either one of those groups or both of these groups could be perhaps a part of creating that shadow HAA or that.
Yeah, and again, that's obviously. This will go on the internet and I'll feel bad about it because it's terrible branding and like that's not the right way to think about it. But I just think there needs to be a place for Harvard alums to come together and both to speak as a group, right, and express different viewpoints and debate and things like that. I just don't think the university's HAA has officially done a very good job of that for the modern era. Look, again, everything I've seen of the Harvard Alumni for Free Speech, I agree with and believe in. I think it's a great organization. I do think when I conceptualize what you'd have to do this, I think that could be a component of it. But there probably are a bunch of Harvard alumni that are not for free speech, right? And so I think the question is like, you do want to figure out a concept, which is hard, but how can you have like a big tent where everyone can again, hopefully have a good productive discussion, right? But people also can then obviously have their deep allegiances to different ideas or ideologies. I don't want to, just to this point we were talking before about, I don't hear from a lot of people who don't agree with free speech and putting academics first, right? You can look at that and be like, that's actually a problem, right? Like it would be good to hear from those people too in some open forum. And as much as we can say, well, the free speech concept should include that, I think in practice that is difficult, right? Just because it is in terms of from a branding perspective. That's just my honest 2 cents. I'm not sure if that's politically correct, but That's what we're here for.
That's what we're here for, is open and honest conversation. Any last questions for Sam or for the broader group? If not, then thank you, Sam, for joining us tonight, for sharing your thoughts, and we wish you all the best in your candidacy. I'll give a quick plug for your website. Please visit Sam's website, and he provides there detailed instructions on how to actually go through the rigmarole of submitting a name to the petition candidate process. HA makes it difficult, but not impossible. Sam, any last words?
No, thank you all for joining. I really appreciate you spending some time with me. And again, Saul, thanks for hosting and putting this together. And yeah, it's samforoverseer.com if you're be up for giving a nomination. It is annoying. It's not that annoying. It's 5 minutes. I don't want to make it sound too scary.
I've done it. It's not as bad as it sounds.
It's annoying, but not terrible. And so, if you do that, share it around. Again, I'd love to see if we can make a difference. And I think this is this is the type of moment that only comes every once in a while, where there's enough energy to really make change. And that, as sad as we can be about kind of the handling of the fall and where we're at, I think the glass half full view is there is a huge silent majority that I think is ready to speak up. And this is the moment for change.
Well, with that, thank you, Sam, and thank you all. Have a great night.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Saul.
Yeah, thanks, Sam.
I appreciate it.
All right.
Talk soon.
Yeah, talk soon.